But what of network formation? In the introduction, I spoke of how analysts often view networks as an outcome or as having a desired structure that managers want to achieve. How do we accomplish and engineer different structures of association? In my own work on high school adolescent networks, I found that they vary in macrostructure from school to school and from classroom to classroom. Some of these settings entail hierarchical worlds, like the first image here to the side, and others that are heavily segregated and clustered, like the second image. Nevertheless, friendship networks are all shaped by the same sorts of tie mechanisms, and those mechanisms I related earlier as homophily, birds of a feather flock together, propinquity, friends of convenience, reciprocity, I give you something, you give me something back, and hierarchicalization, a sense of dominance and control. This kind of raises a conundrum. If the same micro-mechanisms apply to every friendship network, then how is it that their patterns vary? How is it that we see these varied macrostructural environments? The potential answers are interesting. It turns out that certain types of ties usually correspond with a type of network form or pattern. In the case of our schools, the ties are friendships. And friendships tend to be reciprocated and local, so they accent clustering more than they do rank ordering. And this closure and reciprocity of friendship ties happens to be the strongest feature driving high school friendship network formation. By contrast, if the ties actually weren't friendship but weak ties, then it's likely the structure would entail more spanning trees, rank ordering, and fewer groups. Acquaintance ties have greater imbalance and looseness to them, and they enable different network patterns to arise. So depending on the type of tie, we might expect different kinds of network forms. But this doesn't explain how friendship networks differ across contexts. In my work in high schools, we find that the friendship networks vary from school to school because the organizational context amplifies and dampens the salience of certain micro-mechanisms. What this means is that the composition of participants and the utilized organizational rules moderate natural bases of association. Take the case of a large heterogeneous population of, say, multiple equally present races in a school, and one where contact is by choice, and this means that the students aren't sorted into ability groups by the school. In these kind of cases, we find the pattern of association is the most highly segregated by homophily. They have ample opportunity and ample variation in traits to do this. Now, in large schools with no organizational sorting and lots of choice, there also tends to arise rank-ordered cliques. So not only in those large organizations do they form clusters of certainty and trust, but also some degree of ranking. The only time we see random dense associations are when organizations have homogeneous populations and they place members in small interactive settings and they sort them beforehand so that the differential characteristics of these students are already kind of sorted out. And in these contexts, we see if we just induce kind of greater interaction, that they have kind of a random mixing. The same occurs with small settings like classrooms, where you introduce rotating group memberships with frequent interaction of these individuals. What happens is that you can induce a kind of collaboration structure that's highly dense but doesn't have these kind of cliquish hierarchical structures. In addition, if you keep people focused on discussions about tasks or the materials at hand, like organizational analysis, they'll form relationships on the basis of those contents. And so already we have some sense from these kind of dynamic, these models of network formation of what kinds of treatments would induce the networks we'd like to see in organizations. Once analysts have a good description of a network, and once they have some sense of the key influence processes on worker outcomes, and once they know the key mechanisms that drive tie formation to assume certain patterns, the analyst can begin to prescribe all sorts of treatments. Now, it's going to differ by context and by question for many of you, but I hope a lot of you inferred what these treatments might be from the prior slides of this lecture. Nonetheless, what I can do is tell you what many firms will probably ask you for. They're going to want to facilitate the creation of efficient network patterns. And for example, many of them will want interactive, dense networks of positive work-related collaborations as opposed to positive sociable collaborations that don't relate to work. And they're going to want those networks to span groups so good ideas can travel around in the firm and across them. And many companies will also want to forge teams composed of differently skilled persons who are going to rely on each other's strengths. So they're going to want an organic whole that's greater than the sum of their parts. And this will supposedly make a product or solve a complex problem. So they're going to want and seek these kind of things. In addition to facilitating the creation of ideal network forms, companies will also want the analyst to perform network corrections or to solve coordination problems that are endemic to the networks already in place. Now, within schools, we have many instances of this occurring where students assume positions or they form groups that drive behaviors in negative directions, an underperforming group. For example, in many classrooms, certain kids dominate and take up all the teacher's time and attention, thereby making achievement gains less equal. To offset this, researchers have suggested positional treatments. To offset unequal access, the tasks are designed to involve decentralized formats like group work, so more people can talk, and then they call for differentiated roles so everyone has a job to do, no one's left out. And this type of treatment equalizes status within the group, and it renders participation more active and even, so that knowledge acquisition and attainment is similar. Another problem in schools, though, concerns group norms and peer influence through cliques. To offset this, scholars suggest propinquity changes, such as rotating groups and seating assignments, things that we've all seen before, but which we haven't managed manually enough to overcome those kind of suboptimal solutions. So these are kind of simple solutions in a certain way, but I hope they help you think about how networks not only can be formed, but also how they can be redirected through various managerial efforts. Last week, we discussed resource dependence theory, and we described how that theory concerned a firm's power dependence relationships in the environment. This week, a variety of networks are described in the readings, and if we inspect them a little closer, we see they are built up by some of the bridging efforts discussed last week in resource dependence theory, such as joint ventures, associations, interlocking boards of directors, strategic alliances, and partnerships. For example, this week, several authors describe project-based networks or issue networks, where the effort is to organize around a specific project or to work together to push a single issue. Now, if you recall, last week in resource dependence theory, we discussed how this arose in pairs of firms through joint ventures. Some of the authors this week discuss professional networks and trade associations, as well as interlocking boards of directors that bring firms into greater communication with one another. In resource dependence theory, these were seen as a means of co-opting other firms and sharing resources like information. This week, Smith and Wohlstetter describe organizations as forming a group affiliation, or where sets of organizations form a family and they work together voluntarily. In resource dependence theory, these were pairwise efforts similar to this, and they were called strategic alliances or agreements, and they were performed to secure and or prevent advantages or to pull resources together for a group. Last, Goldsmith and Eggers discuss external partnering, such as when governmental agencies contract out particular tasks to private companies and nonprofits, and the belief that coordinating providers will enable government agencies to serve citizens more efficiently. It's important to note that these sorts of partnerships aren't mergers, where total absorption of one firm into another occurs. Instead, they are all partial absorptions and strategic alliances. So the readings this week describe networks formed by bridging efforts that resource dependency theory discussed. Nonetheless, the focus shifts from pairwise relations to the entire network. At issue for network organization is how to coordinate and manage organizations that handle different facets of provision. If I had to put my If I had to put my finger on one key difference between resource dependence theory and network organization, I'd say an important one is their unit of focus. Resource dependence theory considers the egocentric view of an organization and its immediate relations, By contrast, network organizations consider the global, sociocentric view of both direct and indirect relationships. Network forms of organization see the network as constraining and enabling action, and that the wider network of organizations is a source of stability and change for the focal organization. The reading by Davis and Powell describes the difference between resource dependence theory and network organizations best. They argue resource dependence theory views a traffic jam of cars from your own car, while network organization views the traffic jam from a helicopter. From which perspective do you think you get the best understanding of your car's movement in that situation? So if we schematize this, we can see resource dependence theory's view of a firm in the far image. The direct egocentric network is in focus. In contrast, network organization looks at the broader array of indirect ties beyond the focal firm. And depending on how broadly one looks into that network, the situation can change. Here from one being of a peripheral to a group to one of brokering groups. One can also consider similarities between network organization and coalition theory. If you recall, coalitions were like an interest network or a temporary alliance. By contrast, network forms of organizing reflect a persistent structural property or a particular coordination pattern that's maintained over time. In short, the network form of organization is neither a coalition nor a resource-dependent set. Network organization even has similarities with organizational learning theory's description of communities of practice and networks of practice. Many of you will recall this image. For organizational learning, the focus was on practice and the individual relations between participants employing those practices. Each cluster resembles a community wherein discussions of practice occurred. If we stopped there, each group would come to their own optimal solution or a local optima. The linkages across communities reflect the network of practice, and that enables the transfer of solutions across groups, and thereby facilitates their reaching a global optima. As such, organizational learning focuses on individual actors and their relations within and between organizations. By contrast, network organization focuses on organizations as the unit of analysis and discusses the patterns of interconnections across firms, or the inter-organizational network. Hence, if we aggregated the far image, we'd require some sense of how network organization views the same situation. But it's also important to note that it considers multiple types of relations across firms, not just ones about practice. So network organization has some similarity to prior theories, but it also differs. Let's look more closely at how organizational theorists have related the details of this theory. In the list of additional readings, there's an article by Borgatti and Foster that relates a brief history of network organization. They argue that at the turn of the 20th century, network organization was a fashionable description for repetitive exchanges among semi-autonomous organizations relying on trust and embedded social relations to protect their transactions and to lower costs. At the time, proponents of network organization argued that markets and hierarchical structures had become inefficient as commerce grew more global, hyper-competitive, turbulent, and technologically dynamic. And there instead rose a network form of organization that balanced the flexibility of markets with the predictability and stability of hierarchy. And this brought intelligence, flexibility, and speed of response to organizations adopting the model. Network organizations had more enduring and diffuse connections than did markets, and they had more reciprocal and egalitarian arrangements than hierarchies. As such, they were sort of a middle ground, distinct from markets and hierarchical forms of organizing. The network form of organization entailed interdependent firms that competed successfully with larger corporations. Network organizations had become possible because many organizations had become increasingly specialized, and information technologies like phone, fax, email, teleconferencing, computing, and so on made it feasible for them to coordinate delivery of services across multiple firms.